Well, everyone, according to my watch, it's 6:59 and counting down. So I wanted to go ahead and get on and just kind of pull some people in that have a chance to come on in and listen to tonight's rendition of the adaptation of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And I was curious, I wanted to ask another one of those little questions before we get started. How many of you will admit to having watched at one time in your life either the Walt Disney version of it, which is probably the most well-known, or one of the other adaptations? I believe Johnny Depp, they did a kind of an interesting take on it a number of years ago. But I know that from my childhood, I can remember my mom and my dad putting us in front of the wonderful world of Disney, and that's dating that back way back, to watch The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the cartoonish Ichabod Crane and the wonderful horse Gunpowder and all of that. So tonight we're going to be reading the Washington Irving's wonderful tale, which for a lot of people may not know this, but it was first published in 1820. So we're talking about a lasting, timeless story that is now 200 years old. That still fascinates people when it's retold. Tonight, the story will run a little bit longer. I have adapted it. It probably will run somewhere around 40 to 45 minutes top in, but I think that you'll be mesmerized and time will pass by as quickly as before we realize it. So, with that in mind, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Not far from the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river explored by the ancient Dutch navigators, lies a little valley among high hills, one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just a murmur enough to lull one to slumber. The occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker are the only sounds that ever seems to disrupt its tranquility. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, this sequestered glen has long been known as Sleepy Hollow. Some say the place continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual daydream state of mind. The secluded valley abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted dale is the apparition of a headless figure on horseback. Some say he is the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is often seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, the most authentic historians of those parts allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, rides forth in the nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow is owing to his being in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. This specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In this languid hamlet abode a worthy but unfortunate soul by the name of Ichabod Crane, who extended his stay in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children in the valley. As his name inferred, he was tall, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, and feet that might have served for shovels. His small flat head had huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long pointed nose. In truth, he looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His one-room schoolhouse was a low building, rudely constructed of logs, and stood in a rather lonely but pleasant setting at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing nearby. The low murmur of his pupils' voices might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of their master in the tone of menace or command, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch stick, as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. When school hours were over, he was even the companion of the larger boys, and on many afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters or mothers noted for their cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The income from his school was scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, and though lank, he had a voracious appetite. According to the country custom in those parts, he boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. Thus, with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief, he made the rounds of the neighborhood. In addition to his other vocations, he was the community singing master and picked up bright shillings instructing the young folks in singing psalms and hymns. On Sundays, he soon took his station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers where, in his own mind, he consumed the favor intended for the parson. Ichabod Crane's voice even resounded far above all of the congregation, and thanks to his peculiar quavers in his voice, could be heard half a mile off on a still Sunday morning. Being considered a kind of idle, gentleman-like personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments as compared to the rough country young men, the schoolmaster generally took occasion to show up at the tea table of a farmhouse where an abundance of cakes or sweetmeats would be served. In this setting, our man of letters was peculiarly happy among the smiles all the country damsels. As a result, he could be found sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. From his half-itinerant life, he was a sort of traveling gazette, for he had read several books and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's history of New England witchcraft. And though he held good judgment, he also believed as truth such marvelous tales and legends that only increased by his residence in this spellbound region. So much was his gullibility for the supernatural, while he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at nightfall's witching hour fluttered his excitable imagination. The moan of a whippoorwill, the boding cry of a tree frog, the dreary hooting of the screech owl, to the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. His only resource on such occasions was to sing psalm tunes. The good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors during the evening, were often filled with awe, hearing his unmistakable nasal melody floating from the distant hill or along the dusky road. Another of Ichabod's sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives. As they sat by the fire and listened to their tall tales of ghosts and goblins haunting fields, brooks, bridges, and houses with particular interest in the tales of the headless horseman. But afterward, his fears were dearly purchased by the fearful shapes and shadows that beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder lest he should become some uncouth being tramping close behind him. Among his weekly assemblage of musical disciples was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a booming young lass, plump as a partridge, and as rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches. Beyond her beauty, she was withal a little of a flirtatious coquette, as might be perceived in her dress suited to set off her charms. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the other sex, so it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it. Beside the farmhouse was a vast barn, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves above rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up, some with their heads under their wings, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about their dames, enjoying the sunshine of the roof. The ever-hungry young teacher's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself a roasting pig running about with an apple in his mouth. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes with a decent competency of onion sauce. A turkey he beheld daintily trussed up with its gizzard under its wing. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit, which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel. His heart yearned all the more after the fair damsel who was to inherit these domains. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious high-ridge farmhouses, but with lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these visions of delight, his mind became unsettled. He sought only how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such easily conquered adversaries to contend with. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette beset with a labyrinth of fanciful whims. Also, a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood. The numerous rustic admirers beset every portal to her heart, were keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but also ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. The most formidable was Brom Van Brunt, a burly, roaring, frolicsome lad, the hero of the valley due his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair. With a mingled reputation of fun and arrogance with his Herculean frame, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. Famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship and bodily strength, he was always the umpire in all disputes, always ready for either a fight or a frolic. but had more mischief than ill will in his disposition. Yet with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of mischievous good humor in him. The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill. But when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, they always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rambunctious hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, whispers indicated that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Whenever his horse was seen tied to Van Tessel's post on a Sunday night, all other suitors passed by in despair. A stouter man would have shrunk from the competition. A wiser man would have despaired, but Ichabod Crane had, however, a happy mixture of flexibility and perseverance in his nature. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet, gently insinuating manner. Thus, as the singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse. Balt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better even than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. Certain it is, from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interest of Brom Bones evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied out front on Sunday nights. A deadly feud gradually arose between him and the brazen teacher of Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod became the object of Brom's and his ruffian gang's whimsical persecution, and Brom took all opportunities of turning Ichabod into ridicule in presence of his mistress. In this way, matters went on for some time without producing any material effect. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in thought-filled mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool from whence he usually watched all of the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed a flat measuring stick, his scepter of despotic power. The birch stick of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne. On the desk before him, sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop guns, whirligigs, and a whole legions of rampart little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye kept upon their master. The buzzing stillness that reigned throughout the schoolroom was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a scraggly farmhand in a tow-cloth jacket and trousers donning a well-worn round-crowned fragment of a hat. He came up to the school door with an invitation for Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic that evening at Van Tassel's home. Having delivered his message with that air of importance, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and in a hurry. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom as books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves, inkstands overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school turned loose an hour before the usual time. The gallant Ichabod spent an extra hour brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken looking glass that hung up in the schoolhouse. That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was presently domiciled, bad-tempered Hans Van Ripper. Gallantly mounted, Ichabod Crane issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is suitable that I should give some account of the steed. The animal he sat upon was a broken-down plow horse, which had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt, wore out, with a bowed neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and looked ghostly, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore, Gunpowder. You see, as old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod most assuredly was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with shortened stirrups, his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His pointy elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip like a scepter. And as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested atop his nose because of his scanty strip of forehead. The skirts of black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. The forest had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Files of wild ducks streamed high in the air. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of the Herr von Tessel, which he found thronged with old farmers from across the valley in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames in close crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats with scissors and pin cushions and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom lasses, also as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene. Having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. Our hero's gaze fell not upon the charms of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous season of autumn. There was sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes, honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies, peach pies, and pumpkin pies. Besides slices of ham and smoked beef sat delectable dishes of preserved plums, peaches, pears, and quinces, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy. Ichabod was a kind and thankful creature whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all of this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Old Baltus Van Tessel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief, a shake of the hand, slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to help themselves. The sound of the music from the common room summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-haired man who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than a half a century. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and his loosely hung frame in full motion clattered about the room. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and she smiled graciously in reply to all his amorous ogling. All the while, Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the elder folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. But all those stories were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region that breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tessel's and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. However, the chief part of the stories turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country and, it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its descent whitewashed walls shine modestly forth. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along with raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey, affirmed that on returning one night from a neighboring village, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, and that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have wanted to, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that dreary undertone with which men talk in dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with many marvelous and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. Only Ichabod lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth, after no very great interval, quite desolate and chapfallen. He went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most discourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats, and whole valleys of lush grass and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homeward, along the sides of the lofty hills which had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened far off among the hills. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All these stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, while the clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again to the air. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached his fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. Yet it was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured. And under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump, however, with all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral move and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily in vain. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the unnourished ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a splashing tramp sound by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the frightened schoolmaster rose upon his head. What was to be done? What chance did he have escaping a ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up a show of courage, he demanded, stammering, Who are you?" He received no reply and repeated his demand in still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he smacked the sides of inflexible Gunpowder and then shut his eyes as he broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion and scrambled and bounded into the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, the form of the unknown appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof as on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his half-blinded steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind, but the other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stanza. On mounting a rise in the road, the figure of his fellow traveler was brought against the sky. Gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his horse.
His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping perchance to give his companion the slip. But the specter started full jump right after him. Away then they dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body over his horse's head in the eagerness of flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong down a hill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow, shaded by trees, for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in Goblin story. And just beyond swells the green knoll of which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girth of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder around the neck when the saddle fell to the earth. The goblin was nearing on his haunches. As unskillful a rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other, sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone, with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with hopes that the church bridge was at hand. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach the bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. His hooves thundered over the resounding planks as he gained the opposite side. Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish in the flash of fire and brimstone as Brom shared. It was then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups and hurled his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. He tumbled headlong into the dust while Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, but with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast, and dinner hour came and went, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse, but there was no schoolmaster. After diligent investigation along the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt. The tracks of the horse's hooves, deeply dented in the road, evidently made at furious speed, were traced to the bridge. Beyond it, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the schoolmaster's body was not to be discovered. The mysterious event caused much speculation among the knots of gazers and gossips in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. They shook their heads and came to the conclusion Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. Brom Bones, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, and was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin. Many suspected that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. It now is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood round the winter evening fire. And that is the conclusion of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. We'll never know what happened to Ichabod Crane 200 years later. So listen, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening to the live broadcast, and the bunch of folks that listened, got to watch the videotapes that'll be released later. And appreciate it. Wish everybody a safe Halloween, and everybody stay healthy, and look forward to Thanksgiving, I pray. God bless, and have a good evening.